It is Sunday, the 25th of June, 2017. I'm in front of the Unitarian Church in Montreal. I'm just starting up my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and hypocrisy. I just laid down a few chalk slogans, and so far I haven't seen anyone entering the church, and normally by this time there would be at least a few people showing up for the church service, somewhat on the early side. But for some reason I haven't seen anyone yet. So I'm wondering if it's possible that for whatever reason there might not be a church service today. It's a possibility. It's quite unusual. Normally in the summer there are lay-led services, but it's not impossible that for whatever reason there's no service today. But regardless of whether or not there's a service, I will do my protest. It is, after all, a peaceful public protest, and it's intended to reach the public as much as, if not more so, than Montreal Unitarians or the greater Unitarian Universalist religious community. Had an interesting little incident when I was writing the chalk slogans. I didn't record it because I don't normally run the camera when I'm writing the chalk slogans, unless I have reason to believe something of interest is about to happen. And this caught me slightly by surprise, and I decided not to record it for the benefit of the person involved. They didn't do anything wrong at all. Essentially what it is, good day sir, I was writing this chalk slogan when an older Oriental couple came by, and the woman was trying to read the slogan, and it was clear that her grasp of English was absolutely minimal. I don't know what nationality she was, but I suspect she was probably Chinese and had virtually no knowledge of the English language, but she was learning it. And so she was basically pronouncing Unitarian letter by letter. First she was pronouncing the letters, U, N, E, and so on. And then she finally pronounced the word Unitarian. She probably had no idea, what the overall slogan was saying. But it was just interesting that here she was essentially trying to, learn an English word, by reading my chalk slogan. So that was quite interesting. Got a couple of younger guys, 30-something, maybe 40-something, looking at my slogans now, having an inspection, as it were, of each of the slogans. So we shall see if that gets spread around a bit. Or maybe we won't see if it gets spread around a bit. I mean, I'm sure people do talk about this protest. People who see it, I'm sure, speak to their friends about it and so on. So it's probably, the talk of the town, at least in the local area to some extent. So anyway, yes, Unitarians do in fact cover up and even outright deny clergy abuse of all kinds. But that does include even the worst forms of clergy abuse, which of course they try to cover up the most. To borrow a phrase from Stikeman Elliott, Barristers and Solicitors Litigation Lawyer, Unitarians cover up what he calls such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, and which could be generalized as Unitarians cover up child sex abuse, as this slogan says. And I could have put outright deny or deny as well, but just in terms of space, I didn't. But in terms of outright denial, official denial of child sex abuse committed by Unitarian Universalist clergy, UUA moderator Jim Key, just under 3 years ago now, in June of 2014, I believe it was the 28th of June 2014, delivered his first moderator's report to a General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association. And in the middle of his first moderator's report, he included what he called, an official apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. This was essentially a UUA board apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct, and it was supposedly, a second UUA apology to clergy sexual misconduct victims, because the first official UUA apology, which was delivered by former Executive Vice President of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Kathleen K. Montgomery, during the year 2000 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Nashville, proved to be basically insincere, shall we say. The apology itself, as delivered by Kathleen K. Montgomery, was a pretty good apology in my view. It covered all the bases, well, not all of them, but it covered, most of the bases. It didn't make excuses and so on. But what happened is K. Montgomery promised to, and these are exact quote, bend towards justice. So she promised that UUA would improve the handling of clergy misconduct complaints, and of course that did not happen, and complaints continued to be dismissed out of hand and badly handled, and complainants were badly treated by the Unitarian Universalist Association. So they were finally compelled to offer a second apology, and that's what Jim Key did on behalf of the UUA Board of Trustees in his 2014 Moderator's Report. But unfortunately, his apology, or so-called apology, was full of misleading half-truths and disingenuous and even outright lies. And one of the outright lies, what I call a brazen, bald-faced lie, that UUA moderator Jim Key told in his so-called official apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct, is the following. This is an exact quote. "There were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations." So Jim Key is clearly claiming that he personally investigated Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, and that in his personal investigations of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, he found no evidence of sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist clergy. This is ridiculous. This is an outright lie. I personally told Jim Key about several cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers were charged, tried, and convicted of what Stikeman Elliott, Barristers and Solicitors litigation lawyer, Maître Marc-André Coulombe, describes as such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. One of those ministers was Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, who lured teenage Tibetan refugees away from their families in India with promises of a better life in America, and proceeded to repeatedly rape them over a period measured in years in at least one case, and months in others. And he was eventually charged, tried, and convicted of forcible rape, and even what's called unnatural rape, of the teenage Tibetan refugees in question, or at least some of them, and was sentenced to, I believe, 8 years in jail, although I believe he only actually served 4. But here's someone who was charged, tried, and convicted of the forcible rape of teenagers, who I think most people will agree are children. We're talking about teenagers who were you know, as young as 16 years old, possibly even younger, but certainly in terms of the available information, at least one of them was 16 when the rapes began. And as I said, they continued over a period measured in years for one of them, I believe the first one. So, you know, this is clearly sexual abuse of children, at least at the beginning. You know, you might say that teenage Tibetan refugee transitioned into being a young adult at some point during the rapes, but it began when she was 16 years old. And there are other Unitarian Universalist ministers who have been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of preteen children. This is that despicable crime known as pedophilia that the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney, Maitre Marc-André Coulombe, talks about. And that we're talking, you know, clear pedophilia here. I'm not calling Mac Mitchell a pedophile because the children in question were, you know, in their mid-teens when the rapes began. But there are other Unitarian Universalist ministers who have been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of preteen children. So this is just an outright lie on the part of Jim Key. As I said, because I personally told him about several cases. So if no one else said anything, I certainly did. And this is the thing too, is I consider it unlikely that nobody else told Jim Key about, you know, such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape committed by certain Unitarian Universalist ministers. To quote another phrase from the arrogant and aggressive cease and desist demand letters that Maitre Marc-André Coulombe had me served with in June of 2012, just over 5 years ago. So Jim Key outright officially denied any sexual abuse of children in what was supposed to be an official apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct that he inserted into the middle of his first moderator's report to a General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in June of 2014. So that's just one example of outright denial of the sexual abuse of children. Then, of course, there's the Unitarian Universalist Association's false blasphemous libel accusation against me, which Maitre Marc-André Coulombe included in an arrogant and aggressive cease and desist demand letter that he signed his name to. Not sure if he wrote it himself. He might have had some you know, intern write it for him and just signed his name to it, which would be a big mistake on his part if that's what happened. But you know, the letter towards the end said the following: your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory. And it went on to say that these allegedly unfounded and vicious allegations were so defamatory that they constituted the criminal act of blasphemous libel, essentially accusing me of blaspheming against the Unitarian Universalist religious community because I blogged about, well, Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and also Richard Buell of First Parish Norwell, who, to the best of my knowledge, is not and never was a Unitarian Universalist minister, but certainly was a pedophile rapist. And that is the word or phrase I used to describe him. I did describe him specifically as a pedophile rapist because he was charged, tried, and convicted of raping preteen children, children who were no older than 12 years old at the times that the rapes took place. And could have been as young as 6 years old by some estimates. Certainly somewhere between 9 and 12 when the rapes took place. So this makes Richard Buell First Parish Norwell, a pedophile rapist in my books, and I think most other people's books, if not everyone's books. And so it was, you know, here was the Unitarian Universalist Association trying to pretend that my blog posts about Richard Buell and Mac Mitchell were unfounded and vicious. Well, there's nothing remotely unfounded about my blog posts, because they were based upon newspaper reports about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell being convicted of raping teenage Tibetan refugees, and Richard Buell being convicted of raping preteen children, including a female family member who, based on the age differences, was most likely a granddaughter or grandniece. And he also was convicted of raping a neighbor's daughter. So nothing remotely unfounded about my blog posts about Richard Buell and Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell. So when I responded to that false blasphemous libel accusation, you know, one of the questions that I asked was, is this a blanket denial of any pedophilia and rape committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers? Because it was a very broad statement. I'll say it one more time. Your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory and constitute blasphemous libel, which happens to be a criminal act. It's in the Canadian Criminal Code, carries a 2-year jail term if you're convicted. Well, a maximum 2-year jail term. So in theory, you know, if I had been convicted of the crime